I nodded once and whispered to myself, after the last driver left for the weekend. When was the last time anyone? I screamed as the chime above the door sounded, and I heard someone spin around at the front of the store, startled by my reaction. I scrambled to my feet and walked up front, freezing as my eyes met those of Officer Brady's, glinting in the flickering neon. "You good?" He seemed to be both concerned and frustrated. I just stared at him, totally unable to speak. "You on something?" he peered. "No." He looked at me a little longer, but then he walked his immortalized path through the gas station, his gaze drifting over the cooler of energy drinks. I couldn't help but stare right at him, utterly wordless as he moved in almost the exact same way as he had back in June, at last grabbing that same sugar-fry monster. Then he walked to the counter, and my hands were shaking as I took the drink from him. "Hey," he looked at me. "You all right?" I stared into the eyes of the dead man. "Personal stuff. Is something going on?" "Looked like you were looking at the security camera footage when I came in," he noted, and I listened in silence. "If someone's prowling around here, I could investigate." I wanted to address what was really happening, to pick his mind and see if he was really unaware that he was dead, or if he was just haunting this place and all of this was an act. Then I began to wonder if maybe this was some kind of time machine, if I could warn him about what was bound to happen to him and prevent him from dying in the first place. But as I recalled the biker's corpse mounting his waterlogged Harley, I came to the conclusion that nothing I said to this visage of the officer was going to save his life. As I further waged, as soon as he walked out that door, he'd be a corpse too. "You there?" He waved his hand in front of my face. "Talk to me, kid. You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed. Yeah, I'm fine." I slid him his drink. "You gonna tell me the total?" "It's free tonight. On me." "Have a good one, Officer Brady." He blinked. He stood there for a moment as if considering investigating the gas station regardless of my cooperation, trying to get to the bottom of my unusual behavior. And maybe in life he would have, but his fateful march to the street where his life would be taken from him seemed programmed to resume as he suddenly turned and walked out the door, just like he had the last time back in June, taking his energy drink with him. I followed him outside, standing beneath the fluctuating sign as my eyes fell onto the exit wounds in his back, the red streaks oozing from the holes in his uniform. I felt like I could cry at the sight of it. I walked back inside and had made my mind up to quit then and there. I wrote up a note and left it in the manager's office. Then I locked the place up and left the key under the propane cylinder exchange out front, about to text my morning relief where the key was, when I froze. I remembered the girl with black hair and big brown eyes. The neon sign that I had once thought of as my early warning customer alert, and now understood to be some kind of paranormal detection radar, had flickered with her entrance too, just like it had for the biker, and the scratch-off lady, and Officer Brady. In that moment I became weirdly consumed with this desire to know what had happened to her. Maybe it was because I found her cute, or maybe it was because even in the moment that night something felt horribly off. But for some reason or another, I became totally invested in figuring out what had happened to her, to the point that I decided to unlock the store and stick around. I went back to the computer, but for some reason, though I was able to find information about other people that had died in the area, some of whom I'd even seen walk into this gas station's very doors in the middle of the night, I was completely unable to find her, and it really ate at me. I went back to the front at some point around 5 a.m., but still, I was just searching on my phone for the girl, though by the time my relief came in at 6 a.m., I still hadn't found shit. And that was my obsession for the next couple days. When I'd exhausted every article about deaths on 84th, I began to wonder if anyone even knew she was dead. So I searched local missing persons, and I looked into all of them, but still, none of them were this girl. It haunted me for days. I began reliving as much of that night as I could, trying to recall every single detail. I could remember her hinting that the guy she was with was her boyfriend, which even then was a red flag, but now, as I remembered that older guy in the parking lot pumping gas in the dark, it filled me with dread. I didn't get that good of a look at him. I could tell he had some stubble and was wearing a flannel, jeans, and boots, but what good was that? As for his truck, I wasn't sure exactly what make or model it was, just that it was red and looked old. I could only assume the punched-out glass was like the biker's motorcycle, something that had taken place after the girl's death, or more likely, during. And I remembered her asking me if I had ever done something crazy and overnight. And as I mulled over the words for hours, sitting on the back porch smoking a bowl as the sun set before my shift, I ruminated on all the possibilities such a vague statement could mean. But then, when I remembered her saying she was on something like a road trip, it started to click. This creates contrast with the voice in my head. The guy she was with, her boyfriend, must have been taking her off somewhere, probably far from her home. Maybe they'd been talking online, probably in secret, 'cause no parent would let their kid date a grown-ass man like that, and she seemed to be about 18, like myself. Maybe he'd driven to where she lived, and this big, crazy overnight decision she made was climbing into this stranger's vehicle that she'd been tricked into thinking was safe, driving with him for God knows how long as he took her to God knows where. And then they stopped at the Pass and Go on 84th Avenue for gas. At first, that part didn't make sense to me. Yet this place was a couple miles south of 90th Street, which came right off the highway, but why wouldn't he stop for gas at one of the many gas stations out there closer to the interstate? Though, the more I thought about it, the more I started to piece it together. If this guy really was from out of state and was trying to get her back to his place undetected, it made sense he didn't pull right off the highway to the nearest gas station where cops could be combing through camera footage. Instead, he drove off to the most secluded road in the whole town, 84th Avenue. After the observation was finished, the team filled in the perimeter, upper and lower lizards, presumably with a special designation for this particular road, in the whole town. 84th Avenue. I started to feel overwhelmed. I had nothing to go off of to narrow my search, really, and for all I knew, I'd have to look at missing persons listings for people in every surrounding state, and maybe even farther than that. That was just impossible. But at last, saying a prayer to whoever was listening, I typed in the vaguest string of clues I had. Missing girl, brown eyes, black hair, red truck. And then I scrolled and scrolled and scrolled. I searched it first in various counties in Iowa. Maybe she was just from a lower part of the state. But when that didn't yield anything, I searched the same sentence with counties in Missouri at the end, and then Kansas, and then Nebraska. And then, after over an hour of looking, my heart skipped a beat. I saw those big brown eyes looking back at me through my cell phone screen. I clicked on the news article, and there, in her missing persons listing, was unmistakably the girl's face, just like the one in the gas station. I immediately read the article, like it was some sort of divine revelation. Her name was Amber Wicker. She would have just turned 18. In fact, her birthday was only 2 months ago, but her disappearance was 4 months ago, which meant that on the night that she'd actually stepped into the gas station, and not the memory I had cohabitated, she was only 17, making the whole thing even more disturbing to me. She was last seen on her front door's ring camera climbing into a red truck parked across the street, almost totally out of frame, but even in the glimpse of it available in the video, I could tell it was the same one when I saw the 2x4s and blue tarp. My stomach sank as I watched Amber hurry down the driveway, looking once over her shoulder to the safety of the house she was abandoning, then reaching the truck and climbing into the passenger's seat before it took off up the road. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a beleaguered sigh. So Amber Wicker was her name, and as far as the police knew, she was missing. But I knew she was dead. After all, every customer that had walked in beneath the flickering sign had been a corpse, and as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, I assumed her case wasn't any different. So as much as I wanted to stop working at that place, as much as it bothered me to see those ghosts walking the fated paths of their memories through the purgatory that was the pass and go off 84th Avenue, I had to stay. I had to wait until Amber came back so I could gather enough evidence to give to police. After all, though some of the dead only came in once, like the biker, others had come in twice, like Officer Brady, and even others had come in on almost a weekly basis, like the scratch-off lady. Eventually, I hoped she would come back. And so the rest of July, I picked up more night shifts, desperately wanting to be there the night she hopefully returned. I also chatted with Justin, the guy who I'd shadowed and who worked nights when I was off, but his brain seemed constantly fried on something, and if he'd had any paranormal experiences, he hadn't noticed. I asked him about the sign flickering, and he said it did that on occasion, so I knew he'd seen at least some ghosts. But when I asked him about Amber, he wasn't sure if he'd seen her or not. Needless to say, I wasn't getting anything useful out of him. I asked him to just keep his eyes open for her, and if he saw her, to note the license plate of the truck by the pump. You'd think such a strange request would raise an eyebrow, but he was so zombified on whatever the hell it was he was abusing in his off time that he just said, "Sure." In the weeks after I'd pinned down Amber's true identity, I began to research her a bit. I could only find 2 articles about her. One was the one I first found, which just had the basic details of her disappearance, and the other was an even smaller article in which her parents had given a statement and a number to call if anyone knew anything. I really wanted to call that number, but I knew that right now I honestly didn't have shit. I could always say I was at the gas station that night and saw something, but the security camera footage only went back 60 days, so there'd be no proof one way or the other. I didn't have a license plate, and I was a whole state over. I didn't have a lot of faith the police would be able to do much with that, and I didn't want to give her parents false hope. So I decided I'd just wait until her memory replayed again, and I could piece together some actionable details. In the meantime, the more I searched her, I was at last able to find some of her socials, but her Instagram was private, and her Twitter was inactive for years. At last I knew where to find her and her Twitter accounts. I spent hours trying to figure out how to reach her, though when I stumbled upon her Facebook, even though it too hadn't had a post uploaded in 2 years, I felt strangely more connected to her as I scrolled through her photos, this immortal anthology of a dead girl's time on Earth, floating in cyberspace for anyone to find, and sharing her memories from before her life was prematurely snuffed out. I found pictures of her laughing with her friends, smiling at a dance, blowing out birthday candles. I saw random posts ranging from her excitedly proclaiming she'd gotten her learner's permit to complaining about failing some biology test. All these moments of this girl's life, both significant and insignificant, were here forever, memories accessible to anyone that cared to find them. And really, her appearance at the gas station wasn't much different. Though that memory was supernatural, unfolding in real time over a real place, it was in essence the same, just some moment of her existence that unaffiliated people such as myself were able to witness. Return-wise, I studied the mirror, my fingers closing over hers at the base of the window, though whether or not I had been the one to see it for a reason, or my witnessing of it was just as inconsequential and random as me scrolling through her Facebook page, I felt that I was a part of this girl's story now, and it was my duty to help her however I could. But by August, she still hadn't come back. And strangely, neither had Officer Brady, or the biker, or even the scratch-off lady. There was only one other occurrence of the sign flickering, and I guess it was either a no-show ghost or a "fuck you" from the universe, because no one ended up coming in, but worried that whatever supernatural phenomenon had been taking place was over just as suddenly as it had begun, and that I'd never see her again, never be given a chance to atone for my apathetic complacency that night when I could have paid more attention to a situation that was obviously suspicious. And even worse, I was shipping off to college in just a couple of weeks. My remaining days at the pass and go were numbered. So, on August 3rd, while sitting behind the counter in the dead of night, waiting for the purgatorial replay of an apparition's final stop on the drive to her untimely death, I made up my mind. If she didn't come in tonight, then tomorrow I'd take matters into my own hands. It would be proper for me, too, to die in excellent style. It dawned on me that Ember must have died nearby here. The only ghosts that ever walked into this gas station were those that had died on 84th Avenue, and that was true for Officer Brady, who had been shot just down the road, the biker who had crashed into the canal by the bend, the scratch-off lady who had hanged herself in the woods, and all the others I'd seen walk through those doors beneath the flickering green glow. And though I had no idea where to look, I had one thing to go off of. I'd seen the truck turn right at the turnoff. So somewhere north of here, she must have died. And maybe, just maybe, I could figure out where. By morning, I still hadn't seen her, or any ghost for that matter, and after chatting with Tegan, my morning relief, I walked out to my car. But though I'd planned on driving home and getting some sleep, then searching later, I just couldn't resist the urge to look right then and there. And so, in my pass-and-go uniform and all, I walked over to the turnoff where I'd seen that phantom truck head right, and then did the same, walking north up the road. The sun was just barely rising over the trees, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd appreciated a sunrise. Usually I sped home, trying to beat the sunlight to my room where I could shut my blackout curtains and crash as if it were still night. Then I'd wake up at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. But this morning, moving slowly up the road along the canal and constantly scanning for anything out of the ordinary, I couldn't help but enjoy the orange glow above the trees. By the time I'd walked about 2 miles, the sun was fully above the horizon, and cars were starting to sparingly appear on 84th, though admittedly not many, as this wasn't the most direct route to anywhere in town except the pass and go. I'd already passed the infamous bend, and even felt obligated to pause there a moment before the canal, sort of waiting in reverent silence as I remembered the stare that biker had given me, the regret permeating his eyes. By now, though, it could no longer be considered a canal. It was a drainage ditch at best, a muddy, shallow dip off the road, and beyond it was the forest. But then, in my steady scan of the ground in front of me, I noticed something twinkling. I crouched, looking down at small shards of glass on the pavement. Almost like a vision, my mind seemed to play out this simulation, and I was staring at the man as he and Amber argued. He lost his temper and slammed her head into the window, shattering it. I noticed more twinkling coming from the grass before the ditch, and I could almost hear the sound of his boots scraping the asphalt as he kicked the glass off down the hill, trying to cover up anything that had happened. Then I noticed something yellow peeking out of the mud. I stepped down into the ditch, grabbing the corner of the plastic and pulling it out of its muddy tomb. Sitting in my hand was a faded, dirty bag of Lay's Classic, mostly empty, with just a few crumbs at the bottom. My heart raced as I recalled her placing the bag on the counter, and again I could see it before my mind's eye, the man dragging her body out of the passenger seat, her dead-weight foot scraping the bag out with her. He probably didn't even notice in his panic as he dragged her toward the forest, the bag fluttering off down into the ditch below. I walked up the hill on the other side. I stepped into the forest. My breathing started to become heavy as I walked deeper into the trees, terrified as I anticipated just what nightmarish spectacle I might be about to find. But I wouldn't turn back now. And as the afterimage of Ember's conflicted eyes appeared in my mind again, I resolved to find where she was buried so I could finally give her parents peace, maybe even give her peace. And it didn't take much more walking to find clues. I noticed 2 hardly visibly scrapes in the dirt, where her shoes must have been dragging. I carefully followed them, stepping off toward a cluster of trees as they suddenly turned, at last freezing, before what I could immediately ascertain was a shallow grave. The grass all around it was undisturbed, but here, in just this plot, was a clump of uneven earth. Some grass and leaves had been precariously scattered on top in the man's frantic attempt to conceal it, but it wasn't convincing. And as I crouched before the plot, my heart began to thump out of my chest. But I gulped and steeled myself, knowing I had to see this all the way through, for Amber. I wished I had a shovel, but with nothing else I just dug with my hands, scraping the dirt away and trying not to consider the possibility of my fingers abruptly touching her corpse. I jerked as I felt something that wasn't soil. Didn't feel like rotting flesh. So I brushed the sand away, and my eyes centered upon a filthy blue tarp immured in the ground. It was all I needed to see. I stayed right there, pulling out my phone and calling the police, and when they arrived within the hour, I told them I'd gone on a morning walk after getting off the graveyard shift, but noticed the broken glass and trash on the side of the road. They applauded me on my intuition, saying they probably wouldn't have found that suspicious at all. And hell, I certainly wouldn't have either, if I hadn't known the context. From there, I said I walked into the forest out of curiosity, but when I found what looked to be a trail left by dragging feet, I became convinced I'd actually found something serious. And after a little bit of digging, where the ground looked abnormal, I'd seen the tarp and assumed the worst. They were kinder than cops had ever been with me, as they thanked me, and in just a couple of days it was confirmed in a news story that wrapped in that tarp and left to rot in the woods off 84th Avenue for the last half a year was none other than the body of Amber Wicker. The girl with black hair and big brown eyes, taking her next big step in life. The last big step she'd ever take. I was glad I'd been able to help her family get some closure, and hell, even lead to the arrest of the bastard that killed her, whose DNA was recovered at the scene of the crime. But even still, at the end of the day, none of that would bring her back. I just felt hollow. Finding her body, providing her parents whatever relief they could find, and putting that monster in jail still wouldn't bring that innocent, naive girl back to life. And as I listened to a podcast on the graveyard shift on my last night of work at the Pass and Go, 4 days before I'd be heading off to college, I found myself constantly distracted thinking about that. But slowly, I got my mind off things, paying more attention to the podcast and starting to stare off into space at last, the shift beginning to fly by, until just after 4 in the morning. I gasped as the neon sign flickered. I darted over to the side of the counter and peered over the cigarettes. I'll never be able to describe the feeling in my chest at the sight of that old red truck, and though I felt ice in my veins at the afterimage of Amber's killer pumping gas in the dark, when I found her walking to the front of the store, all that remained in my heart was an overwhelming longing, an inconsolable despair. She walked into the store, the chime on the ceiling ringing as she headed right over to the snacks. I stared at her undamaged body, her clean black hair, her innocent big brown eyes. I became emotional at the sight of it, trying desperately not to cry. She grabbed the bag of Layas. Then she walked over to the sports drinks and I leaned against the counter, my chin in my palm as I gazed at this specter retracing the final moments of her life, none the wiser to the horrible demise awaiting her 2 miles away. She grabbed a red Gatorade, then walked over to me, and I felt breathless as she approached, unsure of what I'd even say. "Whoa, you all right?" She looked at me, and I must have been hiding how I felt even worse than I realized. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, scanning the items like a robot. I cleared my throat. "What brings you out here this late?" "Nothing really." The total came up on the screen. "Big brother?" I limply asked, nudging my head toward the heartless man in the dark. "You." "No." It's gross to have a brother." I must have asked the question differently this time, because she stared deeper at me, asking again, "You sure you're okay, dude?" God, I wanted so badly to tell her to run, to just get the fuck out of here, to not ever go near that man again. I wanted to tell her that she was about to die, that he was her murderer, that these were the very final minutes of her life. But this was not a time machine. It was no different than that Facebook page from years ago, just a memory inexplicably suspended in time, just a brief expression of her existence that was as ephemeral an experience as her time on Earth. She wrote to him with a little bitterness in her voice, expressing her frustration with him, saying something like, "Why on earth would you go on Facebook?" And he write me back, and nothing more. "Can I ask you something?" She raised an eyebrow. "Sure. Have you ever done something totally crazy?" "Just overnight." She blinked wildly, visibly taken aback by the words. Actually," she murmured. "Yeah, I have. Why do you ask?" I shrugged. "No reason. What about you?" "Yeah, I did once. I had this weird inkling to follow a trail into the woods, and I found a body. Called the police and reported it." "Creepy," she remarked. I let out a long sigh, handing her the stuff. "Hey, this is on me tonight, all right?" "Oh, sure. How come?" "You just look like a friend of mine," I smiled hollowly. "A friend I haven't seen in a while. Anyway, it's my treat." "Well, all right. Thanks." She took her unceremonious last meal, then turned over to the door, walking toward the oscillating neon. "Have a good rest of your night, Carter." She glanced at my name tag, smiling slightly at me. It broke my heart. "You too, Amber." "Then, as I said, you too." She stood there a moment as if debating whether or not she'd heard me right the first time. Then she turned around and walked outside. But I couldn't just sit there, and before I knew it, I was running around the counter, shoving the doors open and stepping outside. I bit my tongue at the gash on the back of her head, the blood dripping down her hair and onto the back of her top. I had guessed that that had been the cause of her death, but evidently I was wrong, because as she turned back toward me, I found her blue face and the purplish bruising of a seatbelt around her neck. Her clothes were covered in dirt and blood, and the Lay's bag was empty and faded, mud clumped all over it. The bottle of Gatorade was halfway empty. I trembled as I found her teary gaze, the desperation and regret staining her painfully cognizant big brown eyes, not innocent anymore. "Thank you," she whispered. I couldn't possibly muster a response. And then Amber turned, the after-image of her corpse climbing into the passenger side door of her murderer's truck. I remained frozen in place, my eyes following every last fleeting second of Amber's existence as the taillights glowed and the engine hummed. Then the truck pulled off, pausing at the turnoff. And then, as it pulled away, turning right on 84th Avenue and heading to her shallow grave, the neon of the sign stopped flickering, leaving me standing there alone again in silence,